Hello, everyone. I am Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritual Inspire podcast, and my guest today is Zachary Feder. Zachary is a multidisciplinary healer, consultant, and author working in private practice online and in collaboration with Sophia Health Institute, Immanence Health, and Opening to Life in Portland, Oregon, with a truly exceptional team of therapists, naturopaths, body workers, and shamans. Zachary served as executive director of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Edgar Cayce Center in midtown Manhattan, and he spent 3 years in meditation retreat in southern France and India. Zachary is also the author of The Will to Surrender, book one of an oncoming trilogy. Zachary, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you for the invitation, Claudiu. Good to be here.
What I did not mention in the introduction is that your background was in classical music, working with conductor and creative director of the Mariinsky Theater in New York and St. Petersburg, Russia. What determined you to switch from that to the seclusion of a meditation center?
It wasn't really a switch per se. I just happened to get lucky outside of university, having studied Russian and French. I was simply introduced to Gergiev and the foundation he was creating at the time. And it was an unbelievable opportunity right out of university. And I always have loved the arts as a writer, as a lover of classical music and mythology and literature. And so this was an opportunity that came to me. And of course, right out of university, I would not say no. So it was not necessarily a life path, but a capturing of something that came to me. And I was still already immersed in personal development at the time. I mean, this was, to be fair, this was over 20 years ago now. This was the first job I'd ever really got. And I was writing during that time as well. But the short version for why there was a transition was because I had a very early what you might as well call an existential crisis as a result of experiencing the lack of meaning in the stated goals of the mainstream. And that happened right at the tail end of my tenure with Gergiev. You know, it was an amazing environment. Obviously, this is high art. There was a lot of money there, a lot of people with status, and of course that is what so many of us are encouraged to go for in life. And so when you're surrounded by that very early, and you're interested in meaning, it can become very clear very quickly that that is not necessarily where meaning is found.
Yes, it's so true that we are taught in school that a label and a position and a status, it's much more important than a goal in life, like a meaningful goal in life. And in the end, as you said, when we hit that life crisis, we understand that we are just a shell with no purpose and some money in the bank accounts. Some of us with health issues, so then we have to spend the money to get our health back and the sanity back. And it's great that you're able to identify this conundrum early in life. You're able to kind of move on to your own purpose.
Yes, that was exactly it. And I write about it in the book. It was I call it a catastrophic bifurcation where you can either double down on the life of emptiness that you've been sold, or you can take a chance. And for those of us who take the chance, I usually believe it's really worth it.
Yes, and I think this idea that fame is all we have to aim in life is still perpetuating these days. You know, the young generation is looking up to the singers and actors, and in the end, we don't know let's say the misery they live in, not necessarily because they have money, but because their emotional, spiritual, psychological life is a disaster. When you have so much at your disposal, you really don't know how to handle it. And to be honest, some of us in the now understand that those guys sign up certain contracts which won't allow them to step into their life purpose, to bring more meaning to their life.
That's exactly right. We're actually invited to sell parts of ourselves for the status and for the money. And that's too high a cost. And what we find is that individuals who do that, you can last a period of time having marginalized parts of your psyche, parts of your mission, parts of your connection to your heart and to others. But at some point, it's like building a skyscraper where the lower levels are not robust. They're empty. They're vacuums. And so we build higher and higher and higher, but it starts to sway more and more and more. And that's where the collapses that we see are. And I will say I'm quite encouraged by the documentaries that are coming out a lot more recently with, I would almost say, the last generation of celebrities, you could say, who were not necessarily doing work on themselves. And now later in life, whether it's Schwarzenegger, whether it's Sly, there are a lot of documentaries coming out now where a lot of these individuals are looking back on their lives and recognizing how much of themselves and their families they sacrificed for the stated goals of the mainstream. And now realizing that much of those investments they made were not necessarily for them or for those they loved, or certainly not for their soul development, but for the perpetuation of the beast.
Yes. And whatever we do towards, fame and label and status, in the end, the universe, the divine, the source will poke us to come back down and connect within ourselves with the divine and say, I won't let you go this time unless you come back to me, or in a whatever shape or form, but we have to reconnect. And otherwise we're going to get some fist in our face and get bruised by life.
Yes, it's like a cosmic immune system that doesn't let us go too far. Although there are exceptions and we all scratch our head at them.
Yes. And what exactly attracted you to, let's say, India? And do you have an experience which was so profound that you still remember to these days?
Yeah, I mean, you're giving me a great invitation to plug my new book, because that's what it's all about. I felt the emptiness in my body. I felt the emptiness in my heart. What Louis C.K. describes as the forever emptiness. And it was absolutely driving me a little bonkers. It was driving me into a form of mania, into kind of derivations of my persona that were increasingly twisted and strange. And thankfully, I had a family that had been for many years steeped in spirituality, in Buddhism, in Zen, in various forms of the New Age. So those alternatives were there for me, even though as a teenager, I ran from them at quite a sprint. But when you are left with really nothing, the esoteric becomes perhaps not more appealing, but I said to myself, I'm going to give this a shot, because many people have said that the path exists and that it works. And I have to be a scientist about it. I can't simply refute it out of hand. I have to give it a shot, and I have to do the experiment. I have to sit. I have to sit quietly with the pain inside of me and drift ever more deeply into it, and trust that the masters of old, and whether it's the Milarepas or the Krishnamurtis or the Muktanandas, I mean, you name it, there are so many, the Edgar Cayces. You have to trust that they weren't all simply insane. And bearing in mind, 20 years ago, the internet was not what it is today. And the explosion of spirituality and these kinds of paths were not as kind of omnipresent as they are today. I was still finding most of my stuff in books, in old dusty books that just happened to be in a small, discrete family library. And so I was very, very lucky in that regard. But I left. I left America, and I went to the south of France, and I went on French unemployment. So I always say the French government really funded my awakening. And I read for probably 2.5 years as a kind of process of persuading myself that maybe this is something. And then at some point, I started to see my tracks in the sand. And I recognized I can't read my way to an awakening. I have to actually do something. I have to actually sit. And I will say that the books that had always inspired me the most were the memoirs, the spiritual memoirs, the really blood and guts, subjective experiences and descriptions of what it is to go through when you wrench yourself from the false you, from the persona. And the way in which your navigational compass begins to spin wildly off its axis because you suddenly don't know who you are. And you have to trust that there is another you trying to find you just as much as you're trying to find him or her. And so I wrote about that experience in great detail because, well, first and foremost, it was healing to me. And I was guided to write it. This was not something I had to force to write. It was asked to be written. And I think also just to offer yet another alternative path to those who are in that space, which is to say the people who are in pain and who are looking for an alternative. And many are in pain and are not yet looking for an alternative, and that's fine, you know. But there is that catastrophic bifurcation where we hit the crossroads and we think, okay, either I can double down. And I think the Jungian analysts always describe this as a regressive restoration of the persona, which I love that term. It's so well descriptive. But at some point, if you realize that you can't take another drug, you can't keep overworking, another $10,000, $100,000 is not going to change anything. Another failed relationship. When you start to realize all the ways in which you've been suppressing this process and you finally surrender, it's, as my mother used to say, it's the best game in town.
Yes. And while in southern France, I know that the Pyrenees are engulfed in mysteries, and the Cathars were there 700 years ago. So have you had any experiences there? I mean, did you walk up the mountains? Were you allowed in by the spirits of the mountain?
Yeah, I was not visited by the spirit of the Cathar, although I would have welcomed it. That's a great question. Yeah, so the description that I really go into in great detail in the book obviously begins with the existential crisis and the recognition of the emptiness of the game that we're presented with. There is a kind of endless downward spiral of trying to resist that. Then there is an embracing, eventually, after some personal crack in my own psyche, with this possibility of something new. And then there was the reading. And then finally, there was the sitting. And then finally, there was this moment in which I began to feel that movement that perhaps we could describe as the Tao or the still small voice within, or some movement of spirit that I could distinctly feel was not me. And it was guiding me in some way and requiring me very specifically to keep letting go of what I had been holding on to. The old me, the old life, perhaps even all life. It really just kept insisting, you need to let go. And that went on for months and months and months. I mean, this was, tens of thousands of hours of meditation. I mean, that was all I was doing. And it was very agonizing. And I felt that I kind of almost began this dialogue with this energy, calling me in. And so that was the spirit that I was really connecting to. And that now is something that's, a big part of my life. It's a big part of what I teach, actually. It's this idea of aligning to, what spirit wants you to do, because what spirit wants us to do is what we want to do the most, whether we know it or not, whether we accept it initially or not. But once you get into alignment with that, life is so much easier. So much of the responsibility of having to do things correctly is removed from our shoulders, because we no longer have to strategize with, the limited abilities of our intellect in the vastness of the opportunities in front of us. We have this energy that expands when we move in the right direction and subtly contracts when we move in the wrong direction. And that for me is utterly relieving. And I'm so grateful that it's there, because I can't strategize my life. And I don't think really anyone can strategize their life better than that energy, because it's so much vaster and so much deeper, and has a kind of transpersonal wisdom that is so hyper intuitive. It's not just 20 moves ahead on the chessboard. It's 1,000 moves ahead on the chessboard. It's seeing such a greater swath of, I think, our lives. And so that's something that has been, that was the real payoff, I would say. I mean, there were some experiences, of course, and those are great, but they don't last. But for me personally, what has lasted and what has grown stronger and stronger, as a kind of stable realization, you could say, is the connection to this energy, the flow of this energy, like the river, like all the great cliches that come true, the river that guides you, just let go. That has been a wonderful, wonderful journey for me.
Yes, and I think you mentioned the letting go process. I think for us it's so hard to let go because we don't know who we are letting go to. And then it's even harder than accepting, for some of us, that there is God or divinity or source. We'd rather say, yes, there is something there, but we won't let go. Because, that this concept of ego, which a lot of people, even the sages, might not know how to categorize it, because it's not the soul, it's not our body, it's something else, the persona, which comes in play from pretty much nowhere. And again, it's very hard to let go. And what I can make another comparison. All these new cars these days have a guiding system. The moment you move out of your lane, it will beep, and if you take your hands off the wheel, it will bring the car back. So that's pretty much how we can look at it. If you go to the left and you feel some friction, then you can let go, and that energy will bring you back into the right lane.
Exactly. I love the way you put that. That's exactly it. And I have used a similar metaphor with certain, clients and patients, where I've said, you've been driving with one hand on the wheel and a paper map in front of your face, and you're trying to figure your way through. And what we are talking about is that GPS system that's just right there, just a little glance of the eyes, and it's showing you. But I will say, I mean, let's be really clear, no matter how much evidence we get for this, the letting go into that moment is quite terrifying, I think. It doesn't matter who we respect and who has guided us in this. There's always a moment, and I think it has to be that way because it's a rite of passage. It has to be terrifying, and we have to have the courage to take the leap. And that's where I think there is a certain amount of faith that comes in, although I'm not a big fan of the old traditional notion of faith, which is that you have faith forever, without necessarily evidence or a true connection. I think for me, certainly faith was a moment, even if it lasted a year. It was an ongoing moment, but then faith turns into a kind of ever-growing certainty. We want that. God, I can't imagine that I'd be hoping and faithful for, for years on end. It's like I want certainty. I want to be able to feel something palpable and visceral in the body that then has results in life. It's not just aligning with whatever notion of the Tao or the divine we want to call for the sake of it, or because we think it's fun or pretty or because we should. It's like, no, life should get better. And if it's not getting better, then we may not be aligning to it. We might be aligning to something else.
Yes, and you mentioned rite of passage, and I think that this struggle and this anxiety and the life crisis in the Western society, again, in my opinion, is because we don't have the vision quest which was embedded into the indigenous culture. As soon as you want to turn, or you're turning from teen to manhood, you had that test, manhood test, which the elders will put you through, either you're a girl or a boy. And I think that will open up your mind, your heart to the energy of the world, to the divinity, to the source. And then you're going to sail much more smoothly. But in the Western society, we don't have anything like that. We are on our own to discover ourselves.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's such a great point. And I think we're slowly trying to bring those rites of passage back, because we're allowing, boys and young girls to grow into adults without wholeness, without knowing themselves, and even indirectly prohibiting them to know themselves. I mean, that's what I call the military industrial distraction machine is doing. It's like, no. From the cradle to the grave, we're going to try to extract your awareness from yourself, your body, your heart, the source, as quickly as possible, to try and persuade you that it was never there to begin with, and that you have to keep focusing on the next pair of Nikes or your Big Mac or the social media posts or whatever. It's that seems to be the main agenda of the false world, of the matrix, to extract awareness from the self as quickly as possible. And of course, as we know, the longer that goes, the harder it is to bring it back in. And if I may, for two reasons. One reason is that the longer we go without awareness within ourselves, the greater the pain and the disturbing content within ourselves grows. And we feel it. So it becomes more and more difficult to actually enter into that, because it's so great. The painful content of a 50-year-old is far greater than the painful content of a 25-year-old. They will resist it even more. It's like learning a language, as you well know, someone who knows a few languages. The older we get, the harder it is to do it. And the second piece is that we build the false life. If you're having an awakening at 50, you've probably built a life that in some ways is false to you. It's not that we disparage it per se, because you might even have children as a result of that false life, and they can be glorious. But how many people have I known that to really align to that authentic space, we often have to demolish the previous life, or at least radically change it. And that, again, takes tremendous courage and strategy to not have so much collateral damage that it's almost not worth it. And I think some people do actually miss the boat. I've worked with people like that. They've missed the boat, and they've invested so much in the false life that at some point there's no going back. And I just have compassion and understanding for that. I think not everyone's time is in this lifetime, and I think we just have to be okay with that.
Yes, and sometimes some of us have the courage to go through, let's say, plant ceremony to get a boost of what we should see on the other side. I mean, have a glimpse of our life purpose. And we see that, we get excited, we come back from that ceremony, we try to integrate, we share with the family, and then they say, nah, this is silly, nah, don't do that. At your age, come on, man. And then you just postpone it to implement it, integrate it in your daily life, and it's gone again. And you want there to go second time, because you know what the outcome will be and what the society and the family will tell you. So you give up completely.
Right. I agree. But I do think we're entering into, as much as everything seems to be getting worse to some degree, I think it's also getting better. I see breakthroughs happening every day. I see people stepping onto the path every day, rites of passage being created. So I'm still quite hopeful, all things considered.
Yes, and in spite of what the governments did to us to split us in the middle, I think some people are crossing back and they understand that the government is not their friend. And I'm quite adamant to say this almost on every single interview until they goes through their skulls and understand that their main purpose is to just control us and get as much taxes as possible for their own benefit and enjoyment. So that's at least my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think we have a few leaders who are emerging, that give me a little bit of hope. But I agree with you. I think that unfortunately a lot of these positions in life, they require you to be someone who's a little psychotic or dissociated or narcissistic, because the number of decisions you have to make in which you sacrifice yourself or your integrity or someone else, there are so many decisions that your average empath or person of integrity simply would not ascend to those positions of power, because they wouldn't be willing to shear off those parts of themselves to get there. And so unfortunately, the pathways to these important positions in our life, in our government, in the world, really do encourage the pathological individual, and rewards them as well. So that does have to change. And I do think some people are trying to work on that. But I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, and I'll give you two examples from my previous. One is from a previous guest. She's in the financial industry, and after we talk about her spiritual life, in the end, I said, Lynette, I will ask you a question. If you will be offered the treasury position by the president, will you take it? And she said, I am not a psychopath. So that tells a lot. And then a friend of mine, again, I won't name names, he is thinking of running for a president position in a certain country. And I told him, you have to be ready to sacrifice yourself. If you want to maintain the same mindset, the same approach, then be sure that they will come after you. And you won't last more than several months unless you are fully protected. And he understood that. And he's willing to make the sacrifice if he moves forward.
I have tremendous admiration for people like that, because I think, it's a very exotic psychograph of someone who can have a conversation like that with you, and then also feels in some ways compelled to serve at the highest level. I have tremendous respect for that, because I do think we need better leaders. And I do think there's a way of perhaps walking the balance, but they would have to have good advisors.
For sure, yes. Zachary, you mentioned Matrix minutes ago, and I wanted to ask you about the Matrix. And, we hear more and more that we are living inside the Matrix, that we have to escape the Matrix. Others say that the Matrix was a documentary. What is your take?
I think it was a great vehicle for Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne. Still one of my favorite Christmas movies. It's a beautiful work of art. I feel like I should always say, the Wachowski sisters, peace be upon them. It's a transcendent piece of art, and I'm a huge fan of transcendent art. At my core, I work as a healer, and that's my calling. But slightly deeper in my soul, I'm an artist, and in fact, my work does reflect that, because it's become a form of art at this point. But we could take the Matrix in many different directions. I look at the Matrix as almost a necessary straitjacket of the mainstream world for incoming souls. Because when you're an incoming soul, as we all have been, even in our early life, in this life, we don't know who we are. So we need a persona. We need an entire matrix to tell us who we are and what we're supposed to do. Without that, we might be more adrift. And someone might say, well, you could be on a farm somewhere with a beautiful group of people, and you could be much more close to nature. Yes, I agree, but not everyone has that privilege. Apparently, Earth is a very attractive place for souls to incarnate, and it's like the hot place to be, even though it's a little bit like the cosmic Skid Row sometimes from when you look at the news. But I do think the Matrix is this self-perpetuating kind of monolithic behemoth that sells false dreams only to perpetuate itself. It's Sisyphusian, to take the myth. And I know you know this. And I see it as the kind of center of the torus. I'm very interested in kind of toroidal dynamics for many reasons, clinically, psychologically, but also macro-socially. Right? The center of the torus for me is a bit like the mainstream. That's the matrix, the true matrix. And everyone arrives there, and we're wrapped up in that, and that holds us for a period of time until we're ready to make the break. And then we start to break out, and we go to the outskirts of the torus. And the outskirts of the matrix is the fringe. It's the open frontier. It's beyond the pale. That's where the shamans are. That's where the mystics are. That's where God is more palpably felt, I would say, because the noise is much less the further you go out. And if we're lucky enough, we have an experience like that, and then we go back in and we bring that to the center, and we take our experience of God and we sell it as a yoga class or something. We actually allow the matrix to co-opt it. So that's one way of looking at it. But I also see the matrix as a place, it's the ultimate place of separation, where we think that there's something going on outside, as opposed to recognizing that whatever upsets us outside, for example, really is something we have yet to resolve within ourselves. And what the psyche does, the psyche has many kind of innate dynamics that still are not being taught in mainstream world, which is very disappointing, because at this point, there's no reason we shouldn't. I mean, even if it's something as simple as projection. And we're seeing that now with all of the conflict in the world. Why is the G4 not standing up and saying very clearly to the entire world, when we are traumatized, your ability to take multiple perspective collapses into one. And suddenly you are entrenched in your perspective, and whatever the other perspective is wrong and should be attacked. That is a terrible, terrible oversight on humanity, that we're still struggling at that level of primitiveness, So that's another issue that I see with the matrix, that it's a place where we're still lost, and we rely. It's not just that the artifacts of the matrix are selling us something that we don't want. I actually believe it's hand in glove. The psyche that is not quite ready to integrate those disturbing parts of itself have created the matrix culture around us to fill and distract the psyche with diversions and distractions and whatever else you want. So I think at a certain level of understanding, we can't simply blame it, and we can't simply blame the psychopaths for selling us. We're buying it too. We want it. So we have to play this little game with them for a period of time until we realize, okay, I'm ready to go inward, and I'm ready to cut off from that. And then we cut off from that. So that's a few thoughts that I think about when you mention the matrix.
Thank you. And to add to your idea of Taurus, we are on the fringe, and then we decide to go back into the core. I think this is when we have to gently start touching others and explaining others about what we experience, so they can also go on the fringe, increase our numbers, and come back into the center, and not necessarily make the center weaker and weaker, which will be ideal, and have everyone on the fringe, because then the fringe will become the center, but with a different mindset. But again, today the danger is that with so much technology, the matrix will have a stronghold on as many as possible. And I just recently watched a promo of an AI pin, which it's very sleek, very nice technology. You put it on your shirt, and then you just talk and you get the information, you make phone calls by just touching it, search the web by touching it, take photos. Very, very convenient. And my first impression and my first reaction was all the young kids, all the teenagers, and even people in their late 20s will line up to buy it. Doesn't matter the price, but it's new technology, it's cool to have. And this is when the stronghold of the matrix will get even stronger.
Yeah, it's an old technique from
Yes.
kings, queens, religions who have said, you give me a child at 5 and I will give you a Christian for life, a Jesuit for life, you name it. Indoctrinate them early enough and they will not even believe that there is anything else. In fact, they will fight you if you try to take them away from it. It's an addiction. It's an indoctrination. It's a mind control.
Yes.
And that has definitely, I think, taken on orders of magnitude that are tantamount to evil, actually. Because many of these individuals know what they're doing. And there's a level of dissociation that I don't think we shouldn't be mincing our words with, because it's destroying tremendous number of lives. And once again, I think if you're captured early enough, it's just like the Matrix, you can't get out. And I think we're having a reckoning with that. But I will say the antidote for that in many ways is the whistleblower, the person from the inside who calls it out. And we have more and more whistleblowers than ever. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature, just like Neo was. Neo was the whistleblower. He was the bug in the Matrix that changed everything. And so I think we can also trust that with regards to, interactional dynamics, the whistleblower will always exist.
And the association with the Matrix, and you just said that the whistleblower, that Neo was punished, or at least the Matrix tried to punish Neo. And the same in real life. We don't appreciate the whistleblowers. We try to punish them for revealing our corruption, our indecency, and everything else. We don't keep them in high regards. Just put them in jail.
Yes, I mean, and we have to be careful with that. There are two whistleblowers. If we look back to antiquity, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he was the mainstream culture, the abusive king, corrupt, tyrannical. And he was whistleblown, so to speak, by his friend Enkidu, who stood in front of the door to the woman he was going to command his doigt de seigneur on her wedding night, for those who know what that is. And Enkidu said no. And they fought. And the irony is that, the mainstream won. Gilgamesh won because he was stronger. The mainstream will always be stronger than the fringe. This is just a real thing. I mean, the robustness of the psyche of the individuals in there. I mean, in an MMA fight, I mean, you'll likely lose. Because dissociation will always win over integration, at least in a full-on head-to-head battle, I believe. Some people can take issue with that. Maybe that's another conversation. But my point is that Enkidu was the whistleblower who then Gilgamesh befriended and said, I respect you. We fought, I won, but I so respect you. And then they went on a journey. And, the other one is perhaps someone like Prometheus or Christ. So Prometheus was punished for whistleblowing. Christ was punished for whistleblowing, but Enkidu wasn't. And Enkidu, to some degree, is an older myth. So there's something much deeper and older in the collective consciousness that says, if the whistleblowers and those at the fringe can make contact with those in the center and fight well and become brothers and sisters in arms, good things can happen.
Yes, I mean the interaction there could go, as you said, both ways. Both will influence each other. And I wrote about this in my first book, when a pure child was kidnapped by the decadent world, and he was trying to change the decadent world, but at the same time, in the end, he was fully transformed as well. In the process, he couldn't resist the decadence. He couldn't resist that overwhelming feeling of dreadfulness. And only God or the divinity was able to solve that conundrum, that issue which arises in the society.
That's fascinating. You may have been tapping into the Gilgamesh tale, because when Enkidu comes, who's the wild man from the fringe, when he comes back into the world, we are told that he has to drink some alcohol and he has to sleep with some women. So he becomes tainted by the mainstream world.
Interesting. Yes. Let's move on to shamanism a little bit, because I know you work with shamans during your work with clients. How exactly do you involve them in your work? Are they from North America, South America? If you can give us a bit of background on this type of work you do.
Yeah, I have tremendous respect for shamans. And at this point in my career, I'm usually simply refer them out to people if needed. But I still work with individuals who have chronic illness. I'm working with various types of people, but for some reason, my path was to become a multidisciplinarian. I was never satisfied with a single modality. I describe it now as they're all windows to the mansion of the psyche. And we still have kind of fiefdoms of individuals pointing to single windows saying, this is it, this is where it's at. And you really need to see all the windows, and that gives you a much larger perspective on the psyche. And it's all an ability we can synthesize. And I teach this now. This is one of my favorite offerings that I do. It's called the transdisciplinary healer, and it's for healers who might be stuck in the limited approach of one or two or three modalities, whether it's somatic experiencing or hypnotherapy or talk therapy. There are many individuals out there who are doing good work, but they know they're missing something. It's not enough. They're not getting the results they want. And I do think it's because we're in a time now of tremendous synthesis. And the shamanistic piece is very important as well. I will say I do things in an order, and it's usually an order that I have to feel out, but I think is also in some ways preordained, by which I mean, I don't start with shamanism. I don't go to the farthest reaches right off the bat. I listen to the symbolism. One of the things I'm fascinated by these days is, especially when working, clinically, is listening to people's language on the symbolic level. And I'm also listening on a manifest superficial level. But what I mean by that is, when someone says to me, my sister's singing bowl was recently, cracked. I understand that at the superficial level, but what I'm also hearing at the unconscious level is a simple transmission of the grail has been damaged. The vessel has been damaged. That's all I hear. Then they say, my dishwasher was leaking, and it made a tremendous mess in my kitchen or whatever. Yes, I hear that. And maybe they need to replace their dishwasher if they can. But what I also hear is my ability to process and to clean is contaminated and spilling out into my space. I hear that. And if you start to really listen, it's like a language of psyche. It's like a meta language of psyche. And so I'm very interested in hearing that right off the bat, because what you'll find is that someone will tell you, we'll talk for an hour or half an hour. And certainly, I mean, in a clinical, context where someone is actually giving you the issues of their life. And if you listen carefully, the specific, dynamical, symbolic, unconscious issue will simply just radiate periodically, and it will repeat. And so, for example, that's one thing that I will start with, before anything else. It's like, what are the symbolic dynamics that are actually being amplified in this language? And so I might start there. I might go into other elements. Obviously, I do a lot of work somatically. I'm a huge lover of the somatic experience. Obviously, there's a head to heart transmission and transition, I should say. Sometimes the condition to authentic life. These are all, boundaries. I'm a huge believer of depth psychology. I love the dreaming mind. And then every so often you can just kind of feel sometimes someone really needs to connect to that other level. And in those cases, I might do some of my own work, but I will also refer people out and say, hey, I think you should work with this individual, like a shaman.
Thank you for sharing. And I think I assume that also part of the discussion, an important part of the discussion is to ask them, what was your reaction to, your dishwasher spilling on the ground or whatever? And that will also tell you the mindset they are in and the level of calmness and awareness they live in.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you will see the response or even the defense from dealing with it. You'll see the compensation of how they can't clean it up or they cannot stop the evacuation of disturbing content from happening. They might have to shore up their own defenses or their own boundaries with their own content. Or people who, you have the other one is like, my toilet is backed up. They're not processing what they need to process, and it's actually overflowing onto other people. So yeah, I'm always looking, at least at first, at what are the current life circumstances that reflect the unhealed traumas, and then to your good point, what's their response to that, which is usually will be a compensation. It's not their, otherwise they wouldn't be coming to a healer to figure something out, right? They would have worked it out themselves. We all have that, and we all have compensations. It's like what we don't believe we can really get. It's the classic would be love and connection. We don't believe we can really feel love, so we'll settle for connection.
Yes.
Because if you really, really love someone, it's terrifying. Yes. Because you know you're going to lose them.
And the reason I mentioned reaction is because it happened to me recently. I was trying to pull something out from the fridge, but the soup pot was in front of it. And instead of moving the pot and then grabbing what was behind us, I tried to just grab it through. And I spilled the soup in the fridge and on the floor. And I started laughing and said, okay, so take things slowly, have patience. And then it took me an extra half an hour to clean up everything. But the fridge was cleaner. Everything was put properly in place and no one knew about it. By the time everyone woke up, the kitchen was clean. So yes, that's a very fun moment.
Perfect. Well, it's great. I mean, you're a great model in that moment for what we have to do, which is we have to stop and understand every single time something like that happens, we're being taught a lesson and we have to slow down. Okay. Like what just happened there? And then the redemptive action, the courageous redemptive action which you take. So it's a wonderful example. Yeah.
Thank you. And Zachary, I have to thank you for the list of books and movies you posted on your website. And the top of the list on autobiographies is Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And I'm a disciple of Yogananda and, I practice Kriya Yoga. But I want to know what you liked from that book. What attracted you to Yogananda's life?
I mean, what didn't I like? It was all of it. But I think specifically, he was also that first individual that I read, 20 years ago, I read that book. So some of it's a little hazy with me, but I remember him once again going off on his journey and trusting and having complete faith and stepping out and being held at each time. And it really struck me as, I was at least open enough to believe that this was not a hoax and this individual was writing very earnestly. I took it on And don't get me wrong, I mean, at that time, which was once again my own journey, I read every single book on spirituality that I could find. And of course, you find that, 90% of them are saying the same thing. And then you get a Yogananda who comes along and it's a whopper and just smacks you in the face with the same thing, but you can feel the power. And I let it in. I really let it in. And it didn't reduce the terror of taking the journey myself, but it did give me some courage. And then I think at the end of the day, which is what the book really goes into ultimately, is the fact that at some point, are you willing to give up your life to the divine?
Yes, yeah, that's very important. And what else struck me on the book is that the book is not only about himself, it's about other healers, other gurus, other saints. He brings them forward to show us an example other than just his. And all these examples, most of them are recorded, especially the ones in Europe are recorded, are under the watch of the church at that time. So that was an eye opener for me, and I think for hundreds of thousands of people who read the book.
Yeah, these are enormous gifts. I mean, wasn't that the book that Steve Jobs had distributed
Yes.
at the funeral? I love that. And apparently, Condoleezza Rice was offered it, and she said, "No, no, thank you." And then she was offered it again. She was like, "No, no, thank you." And they're like, "No, you really need to read this now." God bless you, Condoleezza.
Yeah, so you know what's residing inside her when she does something like that, and you have to stay away.
Well, that administration certainly has a lot to answer for, and that's one of the great works of healing, to come to terms with uh, our transgressions, whether big or small, whether in this lifetime or another. That is, I think, one of the great works that we can do. And I do see, obviously, those of us who have less egregious transgressions go first. We have to lead the way for others, and we have to be unbelievably compassionate and kind to those who have transgressed and who are trying to make amends. We cannot, relish using them as scapegoats as much as we have. That's one of the great poisons, I think, of the world. Every time a serial killer comes along, everybody rubs their hands and says, "Oh, someone I can project all of my darkness onto." And we literally lick our lips when, someone gets convicted. I think that's a tremendous draw for, the tabloid newspapers and, all these pathological websites that are out there, spraying trauma everywhere. It's because we get to externalize what we have yet to deal with. And there is a tremendous relief in that. But it's infantilizing.
Yeah.
It's not helpful for evolution. And I think we're seeing that with younger people now today as well. There's a tremendously entitled and, thin-skinned lack of ego strength, because we have to have ego strength to take, the ultimate journey, which is into our darkness. But it's worth it, as you well know.
And I agree that forgiveness is one side of ourselves. We have to hardly work on ourselves and project out there, because without forgiveness, there is no love, and there is no love, there is still trauma. We'll add that to humanity's trauma and we'll never heal, and we'll go into the same roundabout. So that's the things we have to face.
Exactly. We're experiencing right now once again the endless blood feuds that should have been, should have ended with the Vikings, and we're seeing it again. And this is conflict mediation theory and practice. That if you slap me, I should forgive you in that moment if I'm strong enough, and then perhaps healing and resolution and restoration can happen. But if I give you back everything you give me with a little extra, never ends.
Yes. That's so true. And Zachary, I mentioned at the beginning your book, The Will to Surrender. What's for book 2 and 3? What are your plans?
So, I could have written a lot of other books, and I have written a bunch of ebooks. Um, but there's enough personal development out there that is nonfiction, by which I mean how-to books. There's a ton of them. And once again, they've been useful to me, but I have never been truly, just me personally, like unbelievably moved. For me, the ones that absolutely changed me were the raw, unmediated blood and guts, transparent sharing of what that dark night of the soul was like. Walk me through it. Don't give me the how-to of like what happened afterwards and your bullet points. No. Tell me when you were throwing up and shitting your pants and crying your eyes out and crying and bawling at the moon. That's what I want to know. Join me there. Because in the hardest moments, that's the you I need. And that's the me that I wanted to offer to those who were in those moments, because that's the one that really helped me. And so I wrote these books, and book 2 should, hopefully it'll come out maybe next summer or next winter, after this winter. But it's my attempt, and once again, it was guided. I have not tried to write these books. I mean, they have gripped me by the throat and said, you're going to write us or we're going to make life very uncomfortable for you. So I've gone along with that. But it's a journey through the psyche, through the stages of the psyche, connecting to the divine. There's an experience of that. Book 2 is actually when I entered the Edgar Cayce Center, and I was 29 years old. And suddenly I found myself running a New Age center in midtown Manhattan. And as you might imagine, I mean, it was something of a wonderful circus. And my job was to sit there and to somehow use discriminating wisdom to understand, who and what was really going on with the shamans and the channels and the psychics and the mediums and the astrological healers and the tarot card readers and the energy healers and you name it. It all came through. And we did a lot of amazing events, but the whole process for me was very much an investigation and an exploration of what's out there, what does it mean, and how do we use it to heal? And I talk about things like UFOs a little bit, and there's the free energy conversation. I mean, all that stuff was fun. But then I go into book 3, which is much more around the fractal psyche, the fact of that we exist, I believe, as a kind of fractal system. And when you have a therapeutic practice, or you have a really tight community, you're experiencing that hall of mirrors with yourself. People are showing you in many different ways, and that has been very illuminating for me in terms of healing and in terms of what the human being really is. Once again, just another elaboration on the fact that we are not discrete, separate entities. We're something so much vaster and more interesting.
Yeah, like any sharing process after a planned ceremony. That's a habit, that's customary. When you go to such a ceremony, that it's ayahuasca, San Pedro, mushrooms, whatever, you have to share your experience, and anyone or everyone will learn from your experience, and they will mirror their own experience onto the others. And again, you share, you get advice, and later on you have time to integrate.
And that's the antidote to the forever emptiness right there. It's not just our own personal work, but having that fractal community around us in which we are constantly reflecting to one another in ways that just fills the heart and makes life, alive with possibility.
Yes, and I know that I made long-lasting friendships from these type of encounters, and it's a benefit. Even if it's a small community, it still benefits the members of the community by sharing, and not necessarily spiritual experiences, but daily experiences that then you can translate into some such as symbolism, and the light bulb will open up in that person's mindset. Whoa, I didn't think about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, you're bringing it, it's a tremendous help when any of us have the courage to do what you're doing, which is to bring that light forward, so thank you for that too.
Thank you. And talking about healing, I know you work with Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt. How it is to interact with him? I know he's well regarded and very much open-minded.
I mean, that was one of the most incredible times of my life when I was at Sophia Health Institute. I mean, he is a verifiable medical genius. It's just the way it is. You see it when you're working with him. He has an extra sensory perception, but he also has an encyclopedic intellect. And I think a huge amount of the interventions we're seeing today, whether it has to do with Wi-Fi, whether it has to do with liposomal melatonin, you name it, a lot of these interventions really came from him, whether it's laser therapy. There's so many things that he is not given credit for and really deserves it as an absolute just juggernaut of a pioneer. Pioneered so many different, and it was very exciting to work there. I mean, I'm not at Sophia Health anymore. I still go on and listen to his debriefs sometimes, and I encourage anyone to really, if they want, get a taste. And, if anyone's really suffering and they have the resources, to have a session with Dr. Klinghardt is a little bit like meeting the Pope, it's like a once in a lifetime experience. And he's a unicorn. He's a really unbelievable practitioner. And I think he's sometimes not, you wouldn't necessarily know this, although in his seminars it comes out, but certainly working there, the occasional conversation I would have with him in the kitchen, he's a very deep individual. He experiences life very, very deeply, very, very sensitive. And so there's a poetry to his work. He's also an artist. Any little tidbits?
Anyway, thank you very much for sharing, because I listened to Dr. Klinger several times, and my friends also recommended him to go deeper into what he's teaching, and I know he's a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, one of his great gifts was the 5 levels of healing, which in some regards is taken from the East and elaborated on. But for anyone who's interested in healing, listen to the lectures on it that he offers with the 5 levels of healing, and the fact that the, level 5, which is the kind of the ground where everything starts, is the biological. And the higher up you get, the more subtle bodies you get. And it's all downward causality. Everything starts at the higher levels and it goes down. It doesn't start at the body, it ends at the body. And that's what I think most allopathic medicine is still stuck in. We're still chasing symptoms. And we're missing the whole point, that there's a psychological precursor to that. There's a familial precursor to that. There's usually traumatic precursors to that. And I do have some hope, because I train some naturopaths these days, and I have tremendous respect for naturopathic medicine. I have some hope that some branch of the naturopathic field, they're going to be the ones that integrate the psychosomatic awareness into the medical establishment, because of course your average MD and even your functional medicine doctor, even though they will pay lip service to the psyche and to those higher realms, they're usually not built for that kind of work. And then the naturopath, however, does seem to have the potential to have one foot in both camps, both the biological, neurological, biochemical, and the sensitive, the somatic, the depth psychological, the symbolic, the unconscious. And once you bring those together, which is what my work has been so much about, then you really have the possibility to offer healing to, complex and chronic conditions. You cannot heal them with simplistic interventions. It just doesn't work.
Yes, and what we find in Canada is that naturopaths are becoming more restrictive in what they can do. The natural products are being, or they try to restrict those. So it's a battle head on with, for our health, for our freedom, sovereignty, everything pretty much is head on right now with these guys at the top. But let's stay positive, keep up the hope, and what can I say? Zachary, we're approaching the end of the interview. Any final thoughts?
Just thank you for your questions and for your sensitivity of thought. I really, really appreciate this. I've enjoyed my time here, Claudiu. So yeah, just gratitude to you. Thank
you
you.
very much for coming, and we'll post more information about where people can contact you and get a one-on-one session with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudiu.
And to my viewers, thank you for watching. Share it, like it. Visit spiritualinspired.ca, claudiumurgan.com. Download a free copy of my book when you visit my website. And until next time, love and gratitude.